Hello and welcome to episode 7 of season 1 of Race in Society. We're talking about race and COVID. My name is Alika Zavalos and my co-host Alana Lenton is behind the scenes this week. We broadcast on our YouTube channel every 2 weeks, so please sign up so that you get alerts on our upcoming sessions. So this week is the final in our first season looking at issues around race, and today's topic is the economics and social costs of COVID-19. Before I begin, I acknowledge that I live on the lands of the Wangal people of the Eora Nation and that I work on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Aboriginal people have lived in harmony with their unceded lands and ecosystems since the beginning of time. Non-Indigenous Australians largely position Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's social and economic challenges through a deficit frame. However, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have suffered intergenerational poverty and are denied access to social mobility. These outcomes are due solely to the oppression and ongoing violence of colonialism, which uses economic laws and institutions to exploit them. And this includes practices such as enslavement and wage theft. However, the COVID-19 pandemic is a live example and one of many, not only of the strength and effective governance by Aboriginal people to keep their people safe where governments have failed, but it's also a stark reminder that Aboriginal people's socio-economic planning is informed by extensive expertise in resource management and community-led commitment to fair redistribution. We acknowledge that Aboriginal cultures have always been concerned with social and economic equity and that their processes for agreement and division of economic and social responsibilities are enacted through sovereign custodianship of country. Moving to today's episode, this is the last in our series, as I said, of race and COVID-19. So we're looking at the impact that the pandemic has on undocumented migrant workers whose labour is exploited in Australia. The economy depends upon the work of racialised people, exposing them to high risk due to casualised frontline services, which have kept the health system and other businesses going throughout lockdown. At the same time, racialised people are provided inadequate protections against infection, including poor personal protective equipment. Racialised people in general are disproportionately employed in sectors that have the highest rates of coronavirus, including in hospitals, factories and in abattoirs. And they're given little workplace rights, including sick leave. In other cases, migrant workers and international students were left without a safety net when Australia went into lockdown. They were simply told to go home or else make do without the economic subsidies available to other Australians, even though for many of these migrants, Australia is their home. So first, we go to our guest, Sanmati Verma, who is an accredited specialist in immigration law. Your work shows that temporary visa holders and migrants without a visa contribute greatly to the economy, especially in farming, but they're caught in a precarious legal status. Can you define undocumented labour and also describe some of the punitive immigration policies that have impacted undocumented workers in recent years? How can this be worse due to the coronavirus crisis?
Thanks, Alika. Thanks very much. Thanks for that introduction. Firstly, of course, I'm speaking to you from sovereign Bunurong country in the west of so-called Melbourne. Sovereignty was never ceded over these lands, and I pay my deference to First Nations struggles across time. As a settler in this country, I have to know the position from which I speak. And when talking about sort of techniques of bordering, techniques of quarantine, techniques of population control, there is a specificity that I need to acknowledge because of the way that Australia was settled and continues to be settled. So really, all of the techniques that I'm talking about here were developed and perfected by the colonial state in relation to First Nations peoples, and that needs to be acknowledged first and foremost. So let me say a few words about undocumented migrants, and I should say, of course, I speak from a particular position. I'm a lawyer. I'm a citizen of this country, so everything that I've learned has been taught to me in proximity to undocumented migrant struggles, and predominantly through the role that I have sort of at the fringes of the United Workers Union. So when we say undocumented, that's a term that's sort of borrowed imperfectly from the North American and the European context, and it is to imply either people without visa status, or people who have a particularly precarious visa status that imposes limits upon them, which they attempt to negotiate. So for instance, people who work when their visas have no permission to work on them, for example. So this is what we say when we mean undocumented. The selectivity of Australia's migration program has become a matter of international note. Sort of neo-fascist regimes all over the world over the past few years have lauded Australia for its selective points-based skilled migration system. So we have Boris Johnson, we have political factions in Canada. I think Trudeau at some stage talking favourably about Australia and how selective it is at choosing precisely the migrants it wants. So the points-based system is something that sort of disaggregates individuals into their various characteristics, age, educational background, employment background, and so forth, and attributes them particular points on the basis of which they're invited to apply for a visa. So it's you put yourself out there first as a migrant, and then you receive an invitation, and only then can you submit a visa application. So this has been a part of Australia's migration regime that's been lauded. And because of that selectivity and how sort of highly technocratic Australia's migration regime has become over time, coupled with the mandatoriness of immigration detention, people, I don't think a lot of folks think about undocumented migrants being a feature of the Australian political landscape. You know, it's sort of thought, it's this island or archipelago, I suppose, depending on the view that you take of it. The border serves the primary function of exclusion. It serves the function of fortifying this so-called nation state, and that people who fall outside of it are just excluded or deported or removed or detained. But of course, you know, the influence of the writing and the thinking of people like Angela Metropolis has sort of told me and taught so many others over time that the mechanism of the border is not necessarily to exclude, but to commodify movement, to dictate its forms, to deprive people of visa status, but primarily in the interests of the state and of capital. So to primarily mediate the terms on which people are able to sell their labour, to make that contract more favourable to capital and to the state. So when we talk about undocumented migrants in Australia, who are we talking about? Because of because of the crisis and because of the way that that's dramatically shifted the approach that people take to the labour market, it's suddenly sorted the entire labour market into, you know, essential and non-essential services. Essential being, you know, the folks who are, you know, not sitting behind Zoom in sessions, who are kind of out there continuing to perform services. So contract cleaning, farms, care work, things like that. And then non-essential. So folks who are able to do their work from behind a computer somewhere. Because of that new frame of reference that's been utilised to view economic relations because of COVID, suddenly it's become an undeniable fact that there are a vast pool of, you know, potentially up to 100,000, maybe more, undocumented people in Australia. And so who are they? I guess what I've talked about over time, or what I've tried to document over the past several years, is how that pool of undocumented workers in Australia comes to be composed, because of course Australia is such a place that you have to arrive with some modicum of legal status and then have it taken away from you. So far as we can see, the pool of undocumented workers is comprised of a series of kind of flows or groups of people who have Australia over time. I guess the longest standing undocumented population are Pacifica folks who have come from Pacific Island nations. Australia has roots of kind of guest worker migration from those states, drawing on old colonial lines of labour that sort of predate federation and sort of rely on the different economic circumstances in Pacific Island nations, created of course by colonialism. So Pacific Island workers who have come under guest worker schemes and then overstayed their visas, that's one group. Another group, of course, is former international students who had been in Australia for a very long period of time, but from 2009 faced a complete overhaul of the skilled migration system upon which they had sort of rested their hopes of permanent migration. So those folks who have fallen out of status find themselves now working, you know, in Australian farms or in the care sector without visa status. There's also refugees who have arrived by boat. So Australia has sort of pioneering legal innovations that it's made to deprive those folks of visa status, so that, albeit that they're released from detention, they're in the community, various bars under the Migration Act prevent them from validly lodging a visa application. And I guess the most recent band of people who form part of the undocumented community are people from Malaysia who have arrived in Australia on subject to visa-free travel arrangements, so an electronic travel authority. And they've come into Australia and then either overstayed their visa or applied for protection visas and sort of are floating around in the community with a bridging visa or without legal status. So this is sort of what I've called elsewhere, I guess, the sort of various sedimentary layers of the undocumented migrant community that are sort of comprised of groups of people who have been subject to various punitive economic reforms and migration reforms that the Australian state's made over time. So, and as I said, research suggests that this is sort of up to 100,000 people, potentially more than 100,000 people. So from March 2020 onwards, when the economy was faced with the reality, you know, that there was going to be putrefying sort of fruit and veg, you know, sort of left unpicked on Australian farms, the government created an emergency new class of visa that was available to people without visa status. So it was a visa that permitted people to remain or to restore themselves to legal status for up to 12 months on a rolling basis, on the basis that they were engaged in certain critical sectors, so that they were doing sort of frontline work. And of course, this has been, you know, lauded by, you know, unions, by some parts of the undocumented migrant community, as sort of a partial amnesty, the first time really that the Australian state has sort of allowed a broad cohort of people to go from not having visa status to potentially having visa status based on doing particular categories of work. There's been, over the past few months, a really broad push towards a broader ranging amnesty. So something that would restore, you know, entire groups of people to documented status based on the work that they do. So that also would be, you know, a significant change in the Australian migration landscape, which has historically, of course, moved in the other direction of depriving people of lawful status. But I suppose my question is, and the question that people are asking, and the question that we should all ask ourselves if we're doing work in this space is, what does it mean to grant an amnesty, or what does it mean to recognise or humanise people on the basis of certain categories of dispossessed labour that they perform? How progressive is it, in fact, for the Australian state to lock people into performing certain types of unprotected, underpaid, unorganised work, sort of ad infinitum? And when we're asking those questions, we have in front of us, of course, the example of Italy, where vast bodies of undocumented workers were restored to legal status, but, you know, just weeks later engaged in nationwide protests, saying that this is an amnesty for tomatoes, this is amnesty for vegetables and not for people. This is a form of immigration reform that is intended to preserve the economy and to preserve the ongoing function of capital as it currently operates. This is not about us. We're just sort of individual units in this broader economic sort of system that's looking to self-perpetuate. So organise, or to stand with undocumented organising at this moment, and are we simply beseeching the state to preserve their currently precarious status, but forever into the future? Or is there something more that we can think of doing in this moment?
Thank you so much for that. The points that you raise are amazing, because we are seeing, I think, a couple of processes from what you say, which link into the broader themes of this, of our series. So as you say, we're seeing these longer established patterns from Australia that have been in place since invasion and since the establishment of the immigration system here, of this selective workplace immigration policies, which effectively stratify people in the same way that racial categories stratify people into positions of subservience and oppression, where some people are elevated and have rights based on the category that they're pushed into. And I was also thinking about the example of the federal government's response to the Hong Kong crisis, which also, as you know, has happened during COVID, and they talked about granting special asylum to people from Hong Kong, but only where they could be seen to set up businesses here that are going to be lucrative. And again, it's these questions that you're raising about certain types of labour being rewarded under this immigration system, and of course reproducing both class and race inequality in the process. And I love that question that you started to tease out for us. What does it mean to grant amnesty on the basis of dispossessed labour? The COVID-19 pandemic is obviously showing that we do need to be more critical in the way that we think about race, and to not remove race from these discussions, because obviously race, as you've expertly shown, race is really motivated by the capitalist system and by economic inequality. Thank you so much for your comments. That was very insightful. So next we're going to go to Sujatha Fernandes, who is a professor of political economy and sociology at the University of Sydney. Your research explores the use and misuse of storytelling to shape understandings of the political activism of racialized people, from Afghan women to undocumented Latin workers from the USA to social movements in Venezuela. Can you tell us about your theory on curated storytelling and its impacts on the politics of race? And how do you see this playing out in race dynamics in Australia during COVID-19?
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you for having me on, and I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm speaking here from the lands of the traditional and sovereign owners of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nations, stolen land that was never ceded and always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Talking about my book, Curated Stories, and how it might relate to Australia, I just wanted to note that, that the book was mostly written and researched in the United States, and I've had more experience working with undocumented populations in New York City and in the United States. I don't know as much about the Australia scenario, and Sanmati has given us such a fine-grained and close description based on all of her extensive work with this population. The only thing I do sort of, you know, in the Australian context is, you know, I grew up here and I had a relative who was undocumented. He came from India and he spent many years living and working underground, and just my memories from my adopted grandmother, who was terrified a lot of the time about, you know, every time a phone call came in, or any time she heard from him calling from some other undisclosed location. And so I just, you know, I sort of know this is something that the undocumented migration in Australia has existed for a very long time. You know, as Sanmati explained, is so extensive today as well. So my book, Curated Stories, looks at this boom of what I call curated stories in the contemporary era. So from media stories to academics and social media to the non-profit world, the ways in which stories are told about marginalized and racialized populations. And what I argue in the book is that marginalized groups are often called to perform stories about being marginalized subjects, and that often the stories that they tell depend on racial stereotypes that may have roots in slavery or racial capitalism or colonialism, and this is often shaped by the structure of, say, the legal structure, where migrants are often called to tell stories at legal hearings or in support of policy campaigns or by non-profits. And so this is what I look at in the book, is I look at how people who tell their stories often reproduce these stereotypes that in some ways harm the cause rather than help further it. And just an example from the book is looking at undocumented domestic workers in the United States, who were often you know, during legal hearings for their Domestic Worker Bill of Rights campaign, were often coached to tell these kind of stories about their bad employer and how this individual single bad employer did such terrible things to them. And they were always discouraged from talking about broader systemic exploitation of the industry. And so we can see how these kind of very individual tropes, as, you know, the bad employer, draw from, you know, furthest tropes of say, the bad slave master under slavery versus the good and caring slave master. So that's just one example of how some of the stereotypes that are used today in the media and in discourse have a very long history. I think another stereotype that's particularly around undocumented workers is that they're often asked to talk about what value they bring to the economy, and that they should be valued because their labour is valuable. And one of the things that, you know, that some more critical social movement advocates have argued is that why should they have to prove that they're valuable to the economy just to be treated as human beings? We should see intrinsic value and worth in them as human beings. So that's just to sort of give you a bit of an idea of some of the ways that I see these stereotypes playing out within the sort of media, within even social movements and non-profits themselves, and the ways in which workers are presented as workers and other marginalized populations are presented in and present themselves through their stories. So in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen a real revival of racial stereotypes during the pandemic. And this was right from the very beginning, when the virus here and abroad, and I'm talking about the US, was referred to as the Chinese virus, and Asians were seen as virus spreaders. They were, you know, treated as infectious and as, you know, and as the sort of villains of the story who had brought COVID to Australia and to the rest of the world. And this sort of, you know, fits uneasily with another stereotype about Asians who, you know, were from the very beginning were often the ones wearing masks. And this led to another stereotype as Asians as very obedient versus freedom-loving Westerners who wanted to just exercise their right to do whatever they want. This is something that persists up until now. And my husband, who's an epidemiologist, says that, well, actually, it's just that Asian countries have a very high level of public health literacy. And yet it's interesting to see how that's sort of converted again into these racial stereotypes of Asians as being obedient. We've also seen a real upsurge in these colonial stereotypes in the media about Black and migrant people as being diseased, as being undisciplined, as unable to control their bodies. And that has even sort of spread into these stereotypes of migrant and Black people as criminals. And even, I think we could include Indigenous people today. There was a video this morning just circulating of police grabbing an Indigenous woman who wasn't wearing a mask. And again, treating people, non-mask wearing people, as criminals. And these calls, this sort of excuse, this calls for increased policing of their bodies. And from the very early days, we've seen how this policing under COVID, this intensified policing, has been very racially divided. And so while the people who actually brought COVID into this country, people who live in wealthier suburbs, who went on cruise ships or who went to ski trips in Aspen and brought the disease back to wealthier neighborhoods, while we saw, you know, that reality combined with, you know, people in the eastern suburbs on the beaches of Bondi and places completely, you know, free to gather in those early days, the police, that there was very heavily in the policing of places like migrant-dominated suburbs like in Western Sydney. So we saw this sort of spatial difference between the different parts of the city, and we've also seen a fairly heavy criminalisation of Black migrants in particular in Australia during this COVID crisis, and I'm thinking of the the ways in which the sort of lockdown of the public housing towers in Flemington and North Melbourne, who were just like, who were treated as these criminals who were undisciplined, who were spreading the virus and needed to be disciplined disciplined and policed and controlled. And we've seen that sort of also in the ways in which the Black Lives Matter protests in June and July of this year were also criminalised, and protesters, even when they were small groups, social distancing, wearing masks was still fined, and people were harassed by the police. There's another example of the two Black teenage girls who were accused of criminal deceit after they entered into Queensland from a hotspot, and there was a real, sort of media furor created around that. And so we've seen many of these cases of these kind of racist curated stories and stereotypes about Black people and First Nations people and people of colour since COVID has hit. And I think that part of this is how during a crisis, these marginalised groups become convenient scapegoats.
Thank you so much. Everything you say is resonating because of this idea of curated stories. And as you say, the being called on to perform race in order to elicit particular sympathies. And that this, as you say, this has been shaped by the legal system. And there are some stories that are acceptable and some stories that racialized people are constantly being told to perform, and then other stories that are obviously being silenced. So as I was hearing you speak, I was thinking about moving back to our earlier discussion on the category of the essential worker. This is an interesting curated story because it's a poorly defined term. It really is about particular types of services that are underpaid. And so we all adopted this language, and politicians have adopted it, the media have adopted it, but it hasn't actually led to any economic reform. So these essential workers, we're told are essential and must keep going to work, and because they can't do their work from home, but they haven't been paid more, their conditions of work haven't improved really. There had been a small subsidy for testing in Melbourne and in some other places, but really their economic conditions haven't improved. So the story is, the hero, but the hidden story, the curated story, is that their race becomes hidden at different points in time. So the majority of those workers are, migrants, refugees, undocumented workers. They are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but there's no curated story about race and inequality when we hear the term in the category essential worker. And the only time race comes into play is when politicians are enacting, and also the media, this punitive lockdown measures that you've described. So it is a function of race that it is constructed to be a slippery set of categories that are really used to put people in positions of oppression by the state, and also reinforced, as you've shown, through many different social processes and institutions. So I'm going to now move to our final question for both of you, so we can hear from you about what are some of the practical ways that we can build solidarity between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have been subjected to these economic inequalities and racialized violence through the economic system. So how can we build solidarity between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and also undocumented migrants who are the frontline workers who are at the greatest risk of infection throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. So first from Sanmati, if we can hear from you, and then Suyafa. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. That's a really important question, and I wouldn't want to say anything definitive. Of course, I'm a settler on this land. What I think is what I think is really critical to remember is, or a critical point of solidarity is to not become is to understand the Australian state's formation as a territory of exception, as a territory of legal fiction as a territory that's founded upon, or as a nation state that's founded upon, the creation of certain legal categories in its own interests. So of course this is what the concept of terra nullius is. This is what the concept of Australian subjecthood is, you know, with the creation of the Australian Constitution and then the exclusion of certain peoples from the Australian Constitution. That what underlies the neutrality of certain legal definitions is, of course, a racialized state of exception that is intended for the purpose of reifying white sovereignty. So that's a critical point of solidarity, I think, between First Nation struggles in the current circumstances and the struggles of people without lawful status. I think also the not becoming distracted, as Sujatha was sort of speaking about, so not becoming distracted or too kind of enamored of certain avenues for progressing causes that segment people into different categories and not becoming too sort of attached to them. So utilising the mechanism of essential work and essential worker as a means of expunging people of their racial status and sort of presenting them neutrally to the state as sort of these supplicants who are worthy of the receipt of certain you know, amnesties or dispensations and so forth. But understanding that at the end of the day, the kind of relations that the state is looking to fortify through the current crisis is precisely the same set of racial relations that it is predicated upon. So not sort of using the concepts of essential worker or, you know, arguments about economic utility or work being a particular legitimizing sort of status that or purpose that a person has in the country, as opposed to people who don't have work or as opposed to people who exist outside of formal economic relations. I think that that's an important point of solidarity, if that sort of makes sense.
Sujatha?
Yeah, I would agree with what Sanmati has said here, and really just to add, I think, you know, where we can to support local organisations, to help with mutual aid efforts, and, you know, I think it's important to push for policy changes like sick pay, COVID leave, adequate health care for legal status. But I also think beyond policy, we need to be mobilising. We need, you know, to support Black Lives Matter protests, frontline worker strikes, industrial action where possible. And we've seen a lot of this in the US just recently. Last weekend, New York City taxi drivers went on strike asking for debt relief. Laundry Workers Association in New York City has also been organising a lot of protests and strikes. And I think, you know, from our position, if we can, you know, that there are things we can do, like contributing to funds to pay police fines for protesters. We can organise teach-ins. We can build coalitions between students, workers, First Nations peoples. And just a really inspiring thing that I saw just yesterday was that last week there was a very small socially distanced rally being held against fee hikes and protests at the University of Sydney campus. And they were organised in groups of less than 20. They were all wearing masks. They were all social distanced, and they were completely following the guidelines set out by New South Wales Public Health, the sort of police arm, and yet the police came in large force, started, you know, made an arrest and issued 9 fines of $1,000 each to these student protesters. And I was really heartened and touched to see that that when they organised a collection of funds for the students, that there were Aboriginal and Black Lives Matter activists who'd made donations to that fund. And I thought, to me, there's, you know, such solidarity coming from those Black Lives Matter protests for the students, and I would hope for the students also for the Black Lives Matter protests. And I think, you know, when we start to all realise that really what's happening here is connected, and that the police, that there is a criminalisation of protests that's going on right now, that's going to affect us all, that's moving us towards a police state, that we need to find ways of coming together and supporting one another. I think there's inspirational ways of how that's already happening.
Fantastic. Thank you both. There's a lot of very practical tips that you've given there, So, you know, you've talked about making sure that we don't become distracted, mobilising and supporting strikes where we can, showing solidarity to Black Lives Matter movements in Australia, which are obviously led by Aboriginal people. And I think the point about the way in which the public health system is being managed through a policing framework is something that has very quickly been accepted by, unfortunately, the majority of Australians, and that's actually not the way the way in which other pandemics have been managed in the past, and it's certainly not best practice from the public health scholarship and practice, of course. And we really must, I really hate the phrase that has taken hold, you know, COVID normal. So I think we need to unpack, what does that mean? What has been normalised, and what rights are we giving away, and what are some of these practical tools that we can use so that we can build solidarity, and that we don't accept that the things that are happening which lead to the criminalisation of racialised minorities in particular and precariously employed people, that these don't become normalised. So thank you both, and a really perfect way for us to end our first season on Race in Society. Just as a reminder, some of our viewers would know that Alana and I set up this series because we wanted to show how race theory and practice have a very real, tangible benefits. So when we engage with critical race theory and critical race practices, we can change processes and ask really important questions and find answers together. So thank you both for illustrating perfectly why we have set up this series. So for our viewers at home, you can see our previous 6 episodes on race and COVID-19 on our YouTube channel. So please subscribe so that you can get notifications of our future videos, which are going to cover other topics on the sociology of race. So until next time, please take care.